Poverty on reserves. Aboriginal communities today. Although Canada is globally considered as a first world country, the poverty on reserves says otherwise and can be easily compared to a third world country. 1 out of 4 children live in poverty. At least 1,600 homes lack hot water, cold water, and flushing toilets. It is bad enough that they live in shacks or tents, but they also have no electricity, plumbing, or heat. Often, 10 to 15 people are forced into one shack. Some of the conditions in native reserves are that there is always a common problem of overcrowding. They are ill-prepared for harsh weather such as rain and winter storms, as well as extreme heat. They lack many of necessities that an average Canadian would consider basic. 12% of all First Nation communities in Canada have to boil their drinking water. 6% of all First Nations homes must live without basic sewage services. Native infant mortality rates are significantly higher than those of non-native infants. Life expectancy of Native Canadian women is 5.2 years shorter than the non-Native Canadian woman. Life expectancy of a Native Canadian man is 7.4 shorter than a non-Native Canadian man. Aboriginals were seen as inferior and savage. Therefore, they had no hope of attaining employment, which contributed in the poverty of reserves. There is an endless continuation of poverty. There's progressively lower levels of education and training, leading to lack of employment opportunities, leading to criminal activity such as sale of illegal drugs for survival, leading to addiction, shattered health, early death, and breakup of family. This leads to an even bleaker future for the next generation. Even if kids are able to attend school, they still experience poverty and hardship. Throughout Canada's colonial past, the cultural genocide and social disruption committed over generations through displacement, discrimination, such as the Indian Act, and the federal system such as the residential school system and reserves, created enduring hardships among Aboriginal peoples and has hindered the re-establishment of social networks and the development of stable communities. Residential schools cause trauma, a lifestyle of uncertain identity, and the adoption of self-abusive behaviors, often associated with alcohol and violence. These barriers keep them from advancing and getting out of their poverty situation. They were so segregated from everyone else because of reserves, which in turn caused big trouble for Aboriginal peoples because they were almost always shunned by non-Aboriginal Canadians. Residential schools gave such a low-quality education that it kept the students from advancing and getting out of their poverty situation. The federal government chose to teach European settlers that Aboriginal peoples are incapable, and to have an Aboriginal identity is derogatory to a person. So, many of today's employers believe that it is to their disadvantage if they hire Aboriginals. Thus, many of said people continue to be stuck in the same position as the past generations. Reserves promise to protect the livelihood of the future generation, but instead, many of the lands provided almost nothing but sickness, starvation, and poverty. There are different approaches to re-establishing and developing stable communities. These are the following. Track it. We need to publish poverty rates on reserves and territories as well as update them more than once every 5 years to raise awareness. You can volunteer and donate in charities, which will benefit Aboriginal communities. Improve the income safety net. One way to reduce poverty is to increase benefits to families. There must be substantial investments on housing, clean water, and education for Aboriginals. Invest in and create jobs on reserves. Make infrastructures within reserves which will provide more jobs opportunities in Aboriginal communities, allowing them to slowly rise from poor living conditions. Facilitate longer-term solutions. allowing bands direct access to resource revenues, adequately funding basic services, and treating Aboriginals like partners and not wards of the state will help address the deeper roots of Indigenous poverty in Canada. Time and time again, Canadian governments have made promises, apologies, and vows to Indigenous people. But words alone don't change colonial attitudes and practices. It's time for meaningful policy changes backed up by concerted, culturally sensitive efforts to help the life in Indigenous communities. Let us take a step further and rid ourselves of these problems. And it can start with you.